Last session, we began looking at what is known as the Oriental Orthodox Churches, those who disagreed with the teaching of the Council of Chalcedon in 451 over how to describe the union of the human and divine natures of Jesus in the Incarnation. The Oriental Orthodox Churches preferred to stick with the traditional understanding provided by Cyril of Alexandria, known as Miaphysitism. But rather than getting into that theology again, I'd recommend, if you're a bit lost, looking back to sessions 24 and 25 of this series. Now, as I said last week, the Oriental Orthodox Churches are 6 independent churches united by this common view of how Jesus is both fully God and fully man, and united by history and shared traditions. Last session we looked at the Syrian Jacobite Church and the Armenian Apostolic Church, and next session we will look at the situation in India. But today we're going south, we're going to Africa, to the Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria and those historically connected to it. We'll start with Egypt, then we'll look briefly at Nubia, and then we'll end even further south with arguably the most interesting and unique branches of ancient Christianity, the Telehedo Orthodox churches of Ethiopia and Eritrea. Now, according to tradition, Egypt was first evangelized by the Apostle Mark. But right at the start, we need to understand a bit of background about this proud and independent land of the pharaohs we call Egypt. Egypt, at the time of Christ and the apostles, was a deeply divided nation in many ways. It had a large Jewish presence until Emperor Trajan put an end to them in AD 117. And there was also in the cities a very significant Greek presence, especially in Alexandria, named after the conquering Macedonian hero Alexander the Great. And this Greek presence in Egypt meant that Alexandria and the nation as a whole was at the forefront of learning and philosophy and rhetoric in the entire Roman Empire. This, combined with the presence of Judaism early on, meant that Egypt quickly became also the foremost centre of learning and philosophy and theology within the early church. Many of the people we've discussed over the past 28 sessions have been from or associated with Egypt, or their historic rival, Antioch. But outside of the city walls, people did not speak Greek. They disliked their foreign overlords. They were nationalists and they were proud. They were the Copts. They spoke Coptic, which was an evolution of the traditional ancient Egyptian language of the pharaohs, using an edited version of the Greek alphabet. They were proud of their unique and ancient heritage, and though loyal to the emperor, they weren't afraid to oppose him when things didn't go their way. And so it was when the Church of the Empire decided against the famous Egyptian hero Cyril of Alexandria, and the Church of the Empire turned against Cyril and adopted the teaching of the Council of Chalcedon. It was never going to end well. The Bishop of Alexandria was deposed by the emperor, and someone fitting the newly established orthodoxy was put in to be the new bishop, known as Pope of Alexandria. And that successor bishop found himself in hot water as soon as the emperor died. He and 6 of his clergy were attacked by a mob inside the church, and their bloody corpses were paraded around the city. The authority of the empire and the emperor would never truly recover from this in Egypt. And that was a problem because Egypt was the breadbasket of the empire. From here, the supporters of the Council of Chalcedon would be called Melkites by the Copts, which kind of had the ring of collaborator with an evil power. With the break made in practice, and despite centuries of attempts by the emperors to try and reunite the churches and keep the Copts happy, nothing was going to improve it. Ultimately, their attempts to try and bring the Copts in only alienated the Western Church under the Pope, who wanted no discussion with the Coptic Oriental Orthodox people. More importantly, the failure to heal this rift left the empire weakened in its wars against the Persians and ultimately the Muslims. Eventually, the empire had enough. They tried to be united, they tried to find out a way to solve this, and so, for a reason of political and racial and religious factors, the empire at times violently persecuted the Copts. There were massacres, there were burnings of churches, and the like. Of course, that didn't improve things for relations within the empire either. As time progressed, more and more of the language of the church in Egypt, outside of a few key power centres still held onto by the church associated with the Roman Empire, the language of the church would be Coptic. The liturgy would become Coptic. The books would become Coptic. The Bible would become Coptic. All in Coptic. Monasticism, which started in Egypt, became a hallmark of the faith, and the church developed its own unique flavour of spirituality and reflection. The Coptic Bible would include all the books that ours do, including what is known as the Apocrypha, and at times perhaps even a few extra books, some of which come from the Apostolic Fathers, which we discussed at the beginning of these series, although the Coptic Church no longer considers them to be scripture. Now, the Copts could also be quite missionary, and their outreach would spread south, converting various Nubian empires, which we will discuss shortly. But things would take a real turn for the Coptic Church in AD 639. Till then, the Copts were used to sporadic periods of persecution from the Roman Empire, but broadly speaking, things could have been a lot worse, and a lot worse they became. As the Muslims conquered Egypt, they massacred thousands, they enslaved women and children. The conquest was brutal and it was efficient, but unlike the terrors of Tamerlane, which utterly eradicated Christianity in Central Asia, the Muslims in Egypt didn't try to destroy all Christianity. Once they were in control, they didn't burn down the churches. No. Instead, the vast majority of the population remained Christian. The Muslims didn't try to convert them at sword point, although, of course, when rebellions began, the swords came out. So what happened? Well, instead, the decline of Christianity in Egypt would be a slow decline. Arab-Muslim immigration would increase, and the Copts lost all contact with the real holders of power in the land. Worse was the heavy taxes that was placed on anyone who wasn't a Muslim, which effectively locked Christians out of successful business and kept them in poverty. If you wanted to make money and be successful and provide for your family and get on in life, you had to be a Muslim, really. Being a Muslim made this much easier. Conversely, converting from Islam to Christianity was a death sentence, and so there was going to be no growth really from that direction. And thus, by the end of the 12th century, Egypt had become majority Muslim, and this decline continued to the present day, where the Coptic Christians make up about 10 to 14% of the population of Egypt, the largest Christian population in the Middle East, although official government statistics claim it's about half of that number. Persecution has also sadly continued to this day, and pretty much every year you hear of a violent terror attack or mob violence burning down a church and killing Christians. And there's also more insidious kinds of persecution. Planning permission for new churches or permission to repair churches that have been damaged through vandalism and violence is constantly denied or lost in the paperwork by the Muslim state. In 1973, the head of the Coptic Church signed a common declaration with the Pope of Rome, affirming that though they used different language about how Jesus was fully God and fully human, in essence they were actually agreed, and this centuries-long feud was really a linguistic disagreement. Likewise, in 1990, agreement was reached even with the heads of many Eastern Orthodox churches that they actually believed the same thing, and it was recommended that the churches go back to being in full communion. However, this has been slowed because the Patriarch of Russia wants more clarification on some of the details, and the influential monks of Mount Athos, who we'll get to much later down the line, absolutely reject any dialogue with the Copts, who they consider to be heretics. So that's the Coptic Church. But what of the missionaries who travelled south to Nubia, to modern-day Sudan? Well, in 540 AD, the kingdom of Nobatia converted to Oriental Orthodox Christianity, and the other two Nubian kingdoms would follow, one to Oriental Orthodoxy and one to the Chalcedonian teaching of the Roman Empire, though that latter one would also join the Oriental Orthodox churches too and come under the influence of the Coptic Church. These three Nubian kingdoms would resist the first wave of Muslim expansion in AD 642, and they could even, in the 9th century, invade Muslim Egypt to rescue the Patriarch of Alexandria, the head of the Coptic Church, from the Muslims. Sadly, this was not to last forever though, and these lands were conquered by the Muslim Mamelukes in the 14th century, and they oppressed Christianity in the region. It survived for at least another century, but it seems to have completely disappeared in modern-day Sudan by the end of the 16th century. This was not, however, the case even further south, in Ethiopia, which was never conquered by the Muslims, nor for that matter by any Western powers in the era of colonisation, Italy repeatedly and famously failing to defeat the Ethiopian kingdom. Christianity in Ethiopia is ancient, and to those of us in the West it appears to be the most exotic and unusual branch of ancient Christianity. It's known as the Telehedo Orthodox Church, with the word Telehedo meaning the local word for being made one or unified, which may refer to the unity of the human and divine natures of Christ, as proposed by the Oriental Orthodox churches. Now, Christianity was first introduced to Ethiopia by the eunuch following his conversion with Philip, as recorded in the book of Acts. And tradition holds that the Apostle Matthew also went to Ethiopia to evangelize people. But Christianity does not seem to have become widespread in the area at this time. That would change when, under the reign of King Ezanna, who reigned over the kingdom of Aksum between AD 320 and 360. At some point in his reign, early on, this king, who used to believe that he was the son of the god of war himself, converted to the faith of Christianity, the faith of his Lebanese Christian childhood tutor, a man named Frumentius. In AD 328, following his conversion, the kingdom adopted the faith. This is before the Roman Empire became officially Christian in AD 380, but after the Kingdom of Armenia, which was the first in AD 301. So, Ethiopia became a Christian nation before the Roman Empire did. Frumentius, who was the person who converted the king, was sent to Alexandria by the king to be made a bishop, and none other than the great Athanasius of Alexandria himself made it so. From this point onwards, the Patriarch of Alexandria, the Coptic Pope, would send a new head to the Ethiopian Church when it was needed. And over the years, this ultimately led to a very odd situation, where generally a very elderly Coptic man who didn't speak the native Ethiopian language, who wasn't Ethiopian, would come down from Egypt to head up the church. He was known as the Abun. But in practice, all power was held by the monasteries and the priestly families. Yes, I said priestly families. The church, after it became the nation's church, was further strengthened towards the end of the 5th century by the 9 saints, who were all monks fleeing persecution after they were rejected by the Council of Chalcedon. Together they would establish vibrant monasticism within Ethiopia and help to evangelize the rural areas and continue translating Christian texts into the local language. Now, naturally, given these links, when the Coptic Church broke away, so did the church in Ethiopia. But the church in Ethiopia did not become Coptic. It remained very distinct in its language, in its culture, and in its practice. And unique is certainly the word for it. The Ethiopian Church holds a fascination with Judaism, and it believes that this dates back to, of course, Queen Sheba. And the kings of Ethiopia from the 13th century onward claimed that they were the descendants of the line of King Solomon himself. So this idea of Judaism and a Judaic dynasty being within Ethiopia came to have real influence in the church, at least from the 13th century onwards, if not before. And to this end, the Ethiopian Church keeps the Jewish Sabbath, which is Saturday, as well as the Christian Sabbath, which is Sunday. So 2 days of rest. Sounds good to me. But they also keep the Jewish dietary laws and laws about the ritual killing of animals, and they practice circumcision, not only of boys, but sadly, tragically, often of girls too. From the 13th century onwards, we have accounts from them that the Ark of the Covenant is in their possession, claiming it was sent to them for safekeeping before the Babylonian exile and the sacking of the temple. Historically speaking, this seems rather unlikely. There's no account of this before the 13th century. The accounts at that time claim that the Ark is covered in Christian crosses, and the truth is that we don't know what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. It isn't mentioned in the Bible when Jerusalem was sacked. And the truth is that at that point in the history of Israel, it just wasn't a significant part of the religious cult of the time. And that's why it's not recorded. Likely, if it was still in the temple, it was just carted away to Babylon. Nonetheless, the belief that they do have the actual Ark of the Covenant with the staff of Moses and with the tablets of the law within it is incredibly important to the Telehedo Orthodox churches, and their church buildings cannot be considered to be consecrated unless they have a blessed replica of it. Likewise, if you look at Ethiopian crosses, they have a very ornate diamond shape at the top, and at the bottom, almost like a key, they have a box. In fact, just below me right here, you can see one of those Ethiopian crosses on my wall with the box shape at the end, which represents the Ark of the Covenant. And these churches also uniquely have the largest Bibles in Christendom, with, in their largest form, 81 books in total. Compare that to just 66 books of the Bible, which Protestants would accept. And their extended version of the Bible includes some books not only unique to them in the Old Testament and the Apocrypha, but also 8 unique additional books in the New Testament. Now, the Ethiopian Church has always remained part of Oriental Orthodoxy due to the fact that their leader, the Abun, was always a Coptic bishop sent from Alexandria. I say almost always remained part of the Oriental Orthodox Church though, because in the early 1500s, Roman Catholic Jesuits were active in Ethiopia due to the rapidly expanding Portuguese trade empire. Naturally, as elsewhere, and in India with disastrous and tragic consequences, these Roman Catholic Jesuit missionaries demanded submission to the Pope of Rome if you were actually a Christian. They didn't make much headway at first, but in 1624 they finally persuaded the King of Ethiopia to abandon the Patriarch of Alexandria and embrace the Pope of Rome. But this submission to Rome met such resistance from the population and the Ethiopian church leaders that he had to abdicate in 1632. His son restored Ethiopia to communion with the Coptic Church of Egypt, and in 1633 he expelled all the Jesuits and later ordered all of their books to be burned. Under Emperor Haile Selassie, the church experienced a time of renewal, with new translations of the Bible which were easily understood being made, education of clergy taking place with a new theological college being founded, and new standards for people to become clergy being introduced. On the back end of this revival in the church and in the nation, in 1948, the Coptic Patriarch of Alexandria granted full independence, known as autocephaly, to the Ethiopian Church. From then on, it would have its own patriarch who appointed their own patriarchs following. Abuna Basilios became the first patriarch of Ethiopia in 1959. Eritrea gained independence from Ethiopia in 1993 and thus had its own independent autocephalous church, the Eritrean Telehedo Orthodox Church. And so that is the fascinating summary, the history of the Oriental Orthodox churches in Egypt, in Nubia, and in both Ethiopia and Eritrea. Next week, we will consider the complicated history of the church in India, and then sum up the state of the various branches of the church we have encountered so far. The Church of the East, following Nestorius, the Oriental Orthodox Church, who reject the Council of Chalcedon and who follow Cyril of Alexandria, and the churches within the old Roman Empire who follow the Council of Chalcedon.